Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the concluding section class of this course on the introduction to modern Indian drama. Let me now summarize what we have done so far in the past few classes. We began with the earliest histories of Indian theatre, which equated Indian theatre with Sanskrit theatre, while dismissing the multilingual nature of Indian theatre, be it Sanskrit and other non-Sanskritic forms of theatre and performance. The colonial historiography of Indian theatre followed the Western chronological categories of ancient, medieval and modern theatre, where Sanskrit theatre lasted from 200 BCE to 2000 BCE, medieval or traditional theatre from 1000 CE, the Common Era, to the present, and modern theatre from the late 18th century to the present. Sanskrit theatre was modelled on Bharata's Natya Shastra, the ancient text in dramaturgy, which provided a lot of information on theoretical and practical aspects of theatre. One of the earliest Sanskrit plays to be translated and studied by Orientalist missionaries and scholars was Kalidasa's Abhignana Shakuntalam, which was translated by William Jones and published in Calcutta in 1789, which is actually a multilingual play with lines in Sanskrit, Shauri Seni, Maharashtrian and Magadhi, but these other languages, the non-Sanskritic languages, were forgotten in the process of translation. The other important Sanskrit play to inspire a lot of early Orientalist Indian theatre was Shudraka's Mrichikatika, or the Little Clay Cart, which again comprised of many of the languages that were lost in translation. There were many other folk performative traditions of theatre in pre-colonial India where theatre overlapped with dance and music, but many of these traditions were dismissed or overlooked by colonial scholars as crude and low forms of performance art. Colonial era theatre drew on Western conventions of theatre in terms of lighting and scenography, while shunning local forms of theatre as crude. Though there was also a turn back to pre-modern Sanskritic models of theatre, which came to be revalued as classical because of nationalist aspirations. There was an attempt to build an Indian nation that was both traditional and modern through a return to Hindu Puranic traditions. The establishment of Indology in the mid-18th century enabled the possibility of this return to Sanskrit theatre because of the interest that European scholars had in understanding India's past. Even the early pre-independence histories of Indian theatre by Indian thinkers and theoreticians of theatre were responsible for equating Sanskrit theatre with Indian theatre, and it was only a legacy of the lasting importance of Sanskrit theatre on Indian theatre. Under the rule of the East India Company, the early playhouses that were set up were in Calcutta in 1775. It was the Calcutta Theatre, the Chowringhee Theatre in 1819, and the Sanssouci Theatre in 1839, which were patronized by colonial officials. The colonial idea of theatre was understood as an enclosed space with a raised proscenium stage before rows of seats. It made theatre a spectacle to be watched by the audience, who were at the same or higher level than the stage. Colonial theatre was an elite cultural art form that was patronized and frequented by the colonial Western and Indian elite, particularly the Parsis of Bombay, who sponsored the early theatre companies. It was only in the late 19th century that theatre spread as a form of mass entertainment in Calcutta, Bombay and Madras to schools and colleges. Theatre then became a commercial ticketed event, and there was a new distinction between the actor-manager and the director. The mere importation of the proscenium theatre did not modernize Indian theatre. Indian theatre in the 1770s was still an elite form of entertainment that was limited to small British populations in the three presidency cities of Madras, Bombay and Calcutta. The early plays that were staged in the late decades of the 18th century addressed social issues like polygamy, child marriage, opium addiction, fate-sanctioned violence, the plight of Indian women and so on. Dinabandhu Mitra's important play Neel Darpan was a polemical attack on the exploitative British indigo planters, which was banned later as seditious and precipitated the passing of the Dramatic Performances Act in 1876 to curb seditious and patriotic tendencies. Theatre scholar Anand Dalal argues that Rabindranath Tagore was the pivotal figure in modern Indian drama in terms of his imaginative stagecraft, modelled after Sanskrit aesthetics that attempted to transform Western theatrical modes of domestic realism and picturesque entertainment. His plays were controversial for the time as they dealt with female sexuality, the orthodoxies of Hinduism, untouchability, anticipated environmental concerns, and so on. He was also responsible for introducing women to the stage, which included women from even respectable families at the time, when male actors impersonated women. The beginnings of modern Indian theatre can be traced back to Parsi theatre. Parsi theatre was a dominant form of entertainment in urban India from the 1860s to the 1930s. Early colonial era theatre companies were owned by elite Parsis, many of whom were wealthy bankers, traders, and philanthropists. The term Parsi theatre is itself a conflicting one, as the actors who joined these companies were Muslims, Hindus, Anglo-Indians, and Baghdadi Jews. Their plays were also multilingual and performed largely in Gujarati, Marathi, Urdu, and English later. These plays were again designed along Western notions of stagecraft, like backdrop scenery, and were divided into acts and scenes. There were many important Parsis who were part of the Indian elite in Bombay who invited to attend English language Bombay theatre, also known as Theatre on the Green. Later on, an appeal was made by various notables like Jamshed Gigi Boy, Jagannath Shankar Seth, and Premji Kawasji to found the Grant Road Theatre, which is located in the fort area of the native town, to cater to the needs for non-Indian language Indian plays. Until 1853, all performances in Grant Road Theatre were in English. Between 1865 and 1890, English was sidelined and the rivalry was between Gujarati and Urdu plays. Grant Road was later supplemented by enlarged ones such as Gaiety and Novelty near Victoria Railway Terminus. Established theatre companies like Elphinstone, Victoria, and Alfred left behind their roots in amateur theatre and became more profitable for their Parsi owners. Shakespeare's plays were also adapted. There was an attempt by Parsi writers and intellectuals to build a history of their own in Gujarati, and they trace back to Firdausi, the ancient king of the Parsis. They performed tales in the Shahnama, Rustam and Sohrab, and so on, which equate the Parsi theatre to the mythical history of the Persian homeland. There was also the presence of the so-called Hindu theatre in Bombay, which was driven by the notion of theatre for the Hindu people, propagated by William Jones and H.H. Wilson's translations from Sanskrit drama. These plays were adopted regional folk styles. Many of the Parsi plays were initially written in Gujarati script. They were also written in Urdu script, as Urdu was favored because of its traditions of poetry and music and song. The most important Urdu play that set off a new tradition of playwriting in Urdu was Inder Sabha by Aga Hasan Amanat in 1853. Although Hindu women were forbidden from acting on stage, there were male impersonators who played women and Anglo-Indian and Jewish actresses on stage. The performance of femininity on stage was a visual construction of bourgeois respectability on stage that contained her sexuality and created a new interiority identifying the ideal woman with her capacity to suffer. Parsi theatrical companies traveled far to Ceylon, Calcutta, Rangoon, Peshawar, and Sindh. Writers, actors, company managers, musicians, etc. belonged to a mix of caste, class, and religious backgrounds. Female impersonation continued into the 20th century. There are few records of the actors' lives, with the exception of the non-Parsi actors like Jayashankar Sundari and Bal Gandharva. The female impersonator averted the potential slander and criticism directed to a transvestite. It thinly cloaked an aggressive heterosexual masculinity, and by performing the wrong woman, the female impersonator was rendered harmless and worthy of sympathy. And therefore, this only reinforced the belief that men could do gender better than women, perpetuating the control that men had over the theatre system and the public control over the female body and its representation. The Anglo-Indian women and the Jewish women who began acting in Parsi theatre adopted Hindu names, which signified an act of subordinating the Anglo-Indian actress, the feminine embodiment of the West, to the Indian male gaze. The actresses were cast in the image of the Huri or pale fairy, a familiar Indo-Islamic trope. Indian modern theatre drew from folk traditions like Yakshagana, Tamasha, Rasleela, Nautanki, Bhavai, Jatra, and Khayal. Many of the post-independence dramatists like Habib Tanvir and Badal Sarkar, Girish Karnad and Vijay Tendulkar turned to folk traditions as what they thought was the essence of Indian theatre. The aim was to establish the importance of the actor as opposed to the urban playwright and the communal involvement and ritualistic action of rural societies. Three of the most significant pre-independence playwrights were Bhartendu Harishchandra, Jayashankar Prasad, and Rabindranath Tagore. all shunned commercial theatre as antithetical to their aesthetics. In her book on Harishchandra, theatre scholar Vasta Dalmia shows the impact that German playwright Bertolt Brecht's dramatic form and techniques had on Harishchandra and other contemporary and later playwrights. Harishchandra was inspired by Sanskrit theatre and wished to recast Sanskrit theatre in a modernist idiom even as it drew from popular forms. Some of Harishchandra's historical plays offered a Hindu-Aryan vision of history that perceived Muslims as invaders. Harishchandra, like Jaishankar Prasad, was constrained by the fact that there were no major metropolis like Calcutta or Bombay in the Hindi-Urdu belt of North India, where theatre could be patronized and institutionalized by the nationalist elite. In our discussion of Vijay Tendulkar's plays, in The Silence, The Court is in Session, the first play we discussed, the play describes the patriarchal enslavement of women within the space of a court and mock trial. The court symbolizes the space of patriarchy where Miss Binari is trapped twice. What begins as a mock trial can no longer be distinguished from the actual play within the play by the end. Binare betrays her own crime of bearing an illegitimate child outside marriage and falling in love with a married man named Professor Damle, who never appears on stage despite the fact that he is also responsible. Ms. Benare's songs and poems suggest her own sense of isolation and loneliness. She is accused of being sexually promiscuous and of being a disreputable character by the other characters in the play. The male characters of the play include Sukhatme and Pongshe, who wish to have a relationship with a bold woman like her, but end up distancing themselves from her because she does not conform to the ideal of a chaste woman or wife. She is charged with infanticide even before her crime has been determined. She is condemned to be punished and shamed because she has desecrated the institution of marriage and motherhood. Her monologue is hardly a defense against her charges. It is more a conversation with herself about the significance of life and her own desire to live to be a reputed schoolteacher. She occasionally ridicules other characters who are all struggling and insecure actors. She is progressively silenced and her voice is usurped by the other characters, including Mrs. Kashigar, who is also a participant and beneficiary of patriarchy, even though she is often humiliated and silenced by her own husband. Even Samant, who is initially an innocent villager and watcher, gets involved in the conspiratorial machinations of patriarchy to trap and victimize a woman for her unconventional life. Towards the end, we also discover that Benari has a very ambiguous relationship to her own body, which is a vehicle for movement and freedom and vitality, but has also been condemned to be stigmatized by the others. In A Friend's Story, you have an unconventional man named Bapu who narrates the story of his friendship with Sumitra. The play switches between past and present as Bapu steps in and out of his character as the narrator and the character in the play. Bapu is a sensitive and gentle man who is secretly in love with Sumitra, but withdraws when he learns she is a lesbian. His roommate Pandey is infatuated with Sumitra when he sees her playing a man in a play he organized with the college where they study. Sumitra is obsessed with Nama, a young woman she acts in the play with, but she also has a boyfriend named Dalvi, who's a conventional and aggressive macho man. Dalvi resents and violently hates Sumitra for being lesbian, and there's a violent altercation between them when he discovers her with Nama in Bapu's room. When Sumitra takes advantage of Bapu's friendship and forges his handwriting and signature to write a love letter to Nama and warn Dalvi, Dalvi assaults Bapu. Sumitra shows no remorse for what she has gotten Bapu into. Bapu remains a gentle and caring friend who tries to convince Sumitra to give up her obsession for Nama. But Sumitra is a narcissistic character who does not show her vulnerability to anyone and needs Nama to validate herself. She remains an isolated character who tries to end her life twice in the play when her family rejects her and she discovers she is a lesbian. In Ghashiram Kotwal, the play takes the form of a choral song and dance performance that depicts the hollowness of political power. The play is a political satire set during the 18th century and describes the court life of Nana Fadnavis, one of the prominent ministers of the Peshwa of Pune. It was first performed in 1972. Ghashiram is a Brahmin from Kannauj who is humiliated and beaten up by the Pune Brahmins for winning the Nana's favor. He is made Kotwal of Pune in exchange for his daughter Gauri, who is to satisfy Nana's lust. Ghashiram takes his revenge by turning Pune into a moral police state where no one has any freedom to do anything without his permission. In his attempt to fight the powers of Brahmanism, he becomes more tyrannical than the forces he opposes. In Kanyadan, Kanya then describes a marriage between Jyoti, the daughter of an upper caste Gandhian couple, Nath Devlalikar, and Seva, a feminist activist, and Arun Athavle, a young Dalit poet and writer who belongs to a family of manual scavengers. The marriage is initially intended by the father and daughter to be an experiment to transcend and dismantle caste differences. Seva and her son Jaiprakash are against the marriage because of Arun's unrefined and violent ways. He beats Jyoti whenever he's drunk and because he's unemployed. There's a clear social class difference between Jyoti and Arun, which by the end of the play has not been transcended. Towards the end of the play, Jyoti is unable to leave her husband. She identifies herself as the wife of a scavenger, as the wife of a Dalit man. She also is forced to question and challenge her father's Gandhian liberalism on which she was brought up. And her father, Nath, himself ends up questioning and challenging his own liberalism because he realizes that unlike his daughter, he does not have to have the experience of living with a Dalit and being able to experience the Dalit person's outrage at social injustice. In Girish Karnad, who wrote his plays both in Kannada and English, and whose plays were also translated by other important directors and playwrights like Ibrahim Alkazi, P.V. Karant, Alik Padamsi, Satyadev Dubey, and so on. So, unlike many of his other fellow playwrights, Bal Sarkar, Vijay Tendulkar, Mohan Rakesh, he also used a lot of Puranic and mythic material into his own plays. Tughlaq was first performed in Kannada in 1965 and then in various other languages including Urdu, Marathi, English, Bengali and Gujarati. It closely follows the historical life of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the Sultan of Delhi, who was known to be an intelligent and accurate ruler but ultimately a failure as an idealistic administrator. There are many sides to Tughlaq's character. He initially wants to be perceived as a secular humanist who wants to ensure Hindu-Muslim unity by lifting the jizya tax that is levied upon non-Muslims and shifting the capital from Delhi to Daulatabad, a Hindu majoritarian city. The move ends in a nightmare of starvation, illness, death, and disease for the people. Aziz, a lowly Muslim washerman, is the one who benefits from and subverts Tughlaq's attempts to create a utopian state where there are no social differences. Tughlaq closely resembles the Sheikh Imamuddin, who is the staunchest critic, and this resemblance suggests the uneasy intimacy between religion and politics. The Sheikh is finally killed in the battle between the Sultan and Ain-ul-Mulk, his governor from Agra, the Sultan's governor, who seeks to avenge himself against the Sultan for being transferred from Agra to the Deccan. But the real double of Tughlaq is Aziz, who manages to subvert every one of his plans to create a secular and wealthy state. Aziz impersonates the Brahmin Prishnu Prasad, whose lands the Sultan seizes and returns, and on whom the tax is lifted, and is promised an official position in the court. Aziz buys the Brahmin's land in a backdated contract and takes advantage of the subsidies that the court gives to farmers. He robs the poor people as they're relocating from Delhi to Daulatabad. He counterfeits the copper currency that the Sultan decides to produce as imperial currency. And he also then murders and disguises himself as Ghiyasuddin, the Baghdadi caliph that the Sultan invites to bless and purify his new capital. Finally, the Sultan is so impressed by Aziz's cleverness and ambition to want more than he possesses, a quality he sees in himself, confers him, Aziz, a position in court. Tughlaq's character has resonances with the post-colonial situation in India, where one sees the secular humanism of Gandhi, the idealism of Nehru, and the brutal authoritarianism of someone like Indira Gandhi, or more recently Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim fundamentalists, all rolled into the figure of Tughlaq. In Dreams of Tipu Sultan, the play is about how official history is written and what counts as official history. The play frames the life and dreams of Tipu Sultan with the conversation between Colin Mackenzie, a colonial scholar, and the court historian Hussain Ali Kirmani. While Mackenzie wants to produce an objective history of Tipu Sultan and is devoid of emotion, the court historian Kirmani was close to the Sultan and uses his personal memories to write his history of the Sultan's life for the British who betrayed him. For him, the Book of Dreams was personal and sacred, but for Mackenzie, it is just another native, authentic source to analyze the Sultan as a strategic ruler. The Sultan's dreams are literary and religious allusions to his absolute power and victory over the British and of his father Hyder Ali, who berates him for sending his sons as hostages to Lord Cornwallis. His power was a function of his ability to seek and sustain alliances with the French, who were known for their superior military warfare, the Ottoman Empire, China, and so on. Even though the official histories portray him as an intolerant Islamic ruler who imposed Islam as the official religion of his kingdom, there are many accounts of his life that suggest that he was an ambiguous figure. On the one hand, he was known for his generous grants given to various Hindu religious institutions, especially the Sringeri Mutt, land grants to Brahmins, and for protecting religious minorities in his kingdom. But on the other hand, he may have used Islam to forcibly convert those who resisted his power. He also lifted the jizya tax from non-Muslims and had people like Purnaya, his Hindu prime minister, as his trusted aide. Tipu Sultan anticipates the might and threat that the British pose to the various Indian princely states, and he realizes that the British want to divide them to impose their supreme rule. Unlike his father, who was more keen to modernize their warfare technology and centralize sovereign authority, Tipu Sultan gave equal importance to trade and commerce. Tipu Sultan admires the unity and spirit of the young British soldiers and claims to have learned how to fight wars from the British. He realizes the basis for the power of European colonial model of sovereignty, especially the British, had to do with the firm control of trade and commerce. Tipu imports silkworms and eggs from China to found his own silk industry. He is abreast with the recent technological innovations in Europe and wishes to retrain his own artisans and workers to draw from European technology. He is finally betrayed by his own officers, who are bribed to enable the entry of Cornwallis and his forces with the support of the Marathas. There are 4 conditions that Lord Cornwallis places before him, which include returning the territory that belonged to the Marathas and paying 6 crores of rupees as war indemnity. While the other princely states are richly rewarded when India gains independence, the Wadiyars are reinstated by the British in Mysore, while Tipu Sultan's descendants are exiled to Calcutta, where they lead impoverished lives. In Hayavadana, which is a rendition of the tale of the transposed heads in the Katha Sarit Sagar, and is closely related to Thomas Mann's own version of the tale in his novel Transposed Heads. The play describes the dominance of the mind over the body in the main plot of the play, which is a love affair between Padmini, the daughter of a merchant, and 2 men, Devdatta, a talented Brahmin, and his close friend Kapila, the strong and athletic son of a blacksmith. The outer frame of the play is about Hayavadana, the hybrid son of a mortal woman and a stallion. He has the head of a horse but the body of a man and longs to be completely transformed into a horse. The play is about the human desire for completion and perfection, which is symbolized through Hayavadana's desire to have the body and mind of the horse, and Padmini, who longs for an ideal man who is the perfect combination of a sensitive and aesthetic mind and an athletic body. Even Ganesha, to whom the initial invocatory verse is dedicated, has the head of an elephant and the body of a man. He is the god who removes obstacles and ensures the completion of a task, and yet seems incomplete with his broken tusk. Hayavadana finally loses his human voice as he turns into a horse with Kali's blessings. But before he loses his voice, he is condemned to sing the national anthem, where his voice already seems to have been suppressed. He stands for the hybridity of the post-colonial subject, who is divided between colonial legacies of thought and being a nationalist fervor. So you are already familiar with the story, the plot of the play, Padmini first desires and marries Devdatta because he is Brahmin and because he has a fine poetic mind. Later on, when Devdatta discovers to his jealousy that Padmini desires Kapila, he goes to the temple to offer his head and his arms to the goddess, and so he ends up killing himself. When Kapila discovers his friend dead and fears he'll be accused of desiring his friend's wife Padmini, he kills himself too. Padmini then accidentally, it seems, exchanges the heads. When Kali brings the men back to life, they have each other's heads, and Padmini chooses the man with Devdatta's head and Kapila's body. But over the years, the mind dominates the body. Devdatta loses his athletic physique, while Kapila has grown strong and sturdy. The question of who is the father to Padmini's son also becomes a debate between the mind and the body. Finally, of course, the Padmini is unable to suppress her desire for Kapila. The 2 men have a duel because they are unable to live with each other's parts, and they end up killing each other's heads, while Padmini commits sati for both of them, thus undermining the equation of wifely chastity with sati. In the Fire and the Rain, which is again the modern adaptation of the story of Yavakri from the Vana Parva of the Mahabharata. In the Mahabharata, Yavakri, the son of the sage Bharadwaja, acquires knowledge of the Vedas after years of penance and uses his knowledge to molest the daughter-in-law of the sage Raibhya, whom he resents. Raibhya creates a Brahma Rakshas, a demon and a spirit in the form of his daughter-in-law, to kill Yavakri, and after Yavakri's death, Bharadwaja curses Raibhya that he will die at the hands of his own son. Paravasu, who mistakes his father, who is wearing deerskin for a deer, fatally shoots him with an arrow. Paravasu falsely accuses Aravasu of patricide, for which Aravasu has to perform penitentiary rites. Aravasu prays to sun god when he is granted a boon, asks that Yavakri, Bharadwaja and Raibhya be brought back to life. In Karna's adaptation of the tale, Yavakri and Vishakha, Raibhiya's daughter-in-law, have an affair that begins both before and continues after her marriage to Paravasu. Paravasu has abandoned her after a year of sexual gratification to preside over the fire sacrifice. In his absence, she meets Yavakri, who has not overcome his desire after years of penance, and their meeting rekindles their love and desire for each other. When Raibhiya sends the Brahma Rakshas to kill Yavakri, Yavakri is initially unfazed as the magical water in his jug has the power to immobilize the demon. But Vishakha empties the jug, desperate to save him, and entreats him to rush to his father's hermitage, which is the only place where he will be safe from the Rakshas. But before he can enter the hermitage, he is intercepted by Andaga, the blind Shudra man who raised him but is ironically unable to recognize his footsteps. Yavakri is impaled by the Rakshas. Paravasu kills his father intentionally out of hatred and finally chooses death to expiate his patricide in the end when Aravasu destroys the sacrificial altar in a frenzy of revenge. There's a parallel story of the love between Aravasu and Nittilai, a tribal woman. Aravasu is on the verge of getting married to her and is willing to renounce his caste community for her love. But on the day of his marriage, he gets late as he has to perform the funeral rites for Yavakri. Nittilai is married to a tribal man from her community. Aravasu has to perform his father's funeral rites and do penance for his brother's act of killing their father. When Paravasu falsely accuses him of patricide, he is beaten up and exiled by the other Brahmins, but he is rescued by Nittilai, who chooses him over her husband. Although Aravasu seeks revenge, Nittilai prevents him from furthering violence. Aravasu acts in a play for which he loses his caste purity that eludes the fatal rivalries between Raibhiya, Paravasu and Yavakri. Aravasu wears a mask and plays Vritra, Brahma's son with a demoness. The actor-manager plays Indra and warns Aravasu that the mask could come to life and control him. In the inner play, Indra is jealous of Vishwarupa, who is Brahma's son with a mortal woman, for his virtual and wise reputation. Vritra always accompanies Vishwarupa to protect him from Indra's plans to kill him. But Indra tricks him and kills him while he is pouring oblations in the sacrificial fire. Paravasu reacts to the scene as Aravasu desecrates the sacrificial area along with the tribes, completely possessed by the demonic spirit of the mask. Nittilai manages to take the mask off, but she's soon killed by her husband and brother who have been waiting for her to make an appearance. The Brahma Rakshas pleads to Aravasu, asking him to request the gods to free him from the bondage of life and death, which Aravasu does at the cost of sacrificing Nittilai and his happiness with her. Indra is pleased with the performance and tells him either Raibhiya, Paravasu and Yavakri can be brought back to life or Nittilai. Aravasu chooses the former and Nittilai becomes a scapegoat for the redemption of the Brahmin community and Vishakha is chastised for her transgression. So while Brahmins are equated with ambition and greed for power and violence, Shudras are equated with those who are kind and compassionate and form the basis for the collective community, perhaps freed of caste. In Broken Images, it takes the form of a monologue between Manjula and a virtual on-screen image. The play focuses on the politics of choosing to write and publish in English as opposed to regional vernaculars like Kannada. While Manjula is an established Kannada writer who teaches English in a college, her disabled sister Malini is an English writer whose novel Manjula plagiarizes and publishes under her own name. Manjula openly confesses to the interrogations of the image, which is a symptom of her repressed unconscious, that she is not ashamed of writing and publishing in English, which has won her fame and money. There's a distinction between the image that reveals Manjula's unconscious desire for fame and power, the way Manjula presents herself as someone who is innocent, and the transformation in our perception of her through the image's interrogations of Manjula. Manjula represents the insecurity of non-English language writers and readerships who are threatened by the growing power and popularity and wealth of English language books. Manjula remembers feeling neglected by her parents who focused all their attention on her sister who led a life of disability. She is also jealous and suspicious of Malini's intellectual relationship with her husband Pramod. The image finally declares it is Malini and says Manjula was decimated the moment she read Malini's novel. The play is also about the mediated relationship between the author, the text, and the reader. Manjula identifies herself with one of the cousins in the autobiographical novel, where she sees herself reflected as a shallow and petty woman. The text takes on the life of the author and gains meaning through the figure of the reader, who is not a biographical figure, but a signifier just like the author, and is incorporated into the text. The relationship between languages, author, and text is mediated by power. In Mahesh L. Kanchwar, again born 1939, born a Telugu Brahmin family, migrated to Vidarbha district in Maharashtra, where he completed his education in Nagpur University. He experimented a lot with expressionist and absurdist theatre, and theatre for him had to do with realizing the multiple possibilities of the experience of life itself. He challenged the hierarchy between art and ideology, between individual and social or collective pain and suffering. There's an emphasis on poetry and the gestural repertoire of the body to connote emotions. In Garbo, portrays the alienation and isolation of urban life in Bombay from the perspective of three male characters from Nagpur. Srimant is a wealthy businessman, Intuk a professor, and Pansy an adolescent. They're all struggling and experience the sterility of their lives. Garbo is a sex machine for Srimant, an exalted mother figure for Pansy, and an inexhaustible aesthetic ideal for Intuk. All the men seek redemption and hope through the imagination of Garbo, on whom they project their frustrations and fantasies. They use their desires to transcend themselves, but their private fantasies of Garbo is undermined by her bitter comebacks and self-contempt as a B-grade actress who has sexual affairs with many men. Each of these men see the collective salvation in Garbo's baby that they later discover was aborted by her during a shoot. They are initially hopeful that the baby will inherit their name, but they are later disillusioned and realize they are condemned to remain in their world of filth and sterility. Srimant is revealed to be an emasculate and insecure man who needs Garbo to validate his masculinity and his sexual prowess, while he actually wants Pansy, with whom he has a sexual affair. Intuk confesses he is a poet who lacks originality and needed Garbo as his muse who would inspire artistic creativity, but now that she cannot become a mother again, they welcome her as a part of their sterile world. The body seems to be the only reality and the sexual act the only way of potentially attaining identity and recognition and relief from a sterile world. But even the body ends up becoming a lie. Srimant stabs Garbo in the end. The blood is real, but Garbo is no more. They realize that Garbo they knew was merely an embodiment of their fantasies of redemption and transcendence. She is barely given the opportunity to speak or resist their constructions of her. The old stone mansion is set in the old decrepit mansion of the Deshpandes, a landed Brahmin family that's losing its status and power to newly instituted land reforms. The growth of Bombay as a metropolis that promises jobs enables many other caste groups from the village, particularly the cooks who work for the Deshpandes, to migrate to Bombay in search of jobs. Other lower caste groups brew liquor or work in newly set up restaurants in the village. The play was inspired by Anton Chekhov's play The Cherry Orchard that described socio-economic transformations in early 20th century Russia with the abolition of serfdom, the decline of the aristocracy, and the rise of the middle class. The orchard that belongs to a landlord that has to be auctioned and sold to a newly freed serf and is chopped off at the end of the play as the family moves out. In the old stone mansion, the tractor is a symbol of the hollow prestige of the Deshpande family, something that is no longer an economic investment in a village with small land holdings and hardly any electricity. Bhaskar, the eldest son, refuses to accept that they are no longer as rich as they were. They are indebted to the vegetable seller who has now started his own business and wants to buy their orchard if they can't repay their debts. Bhaskar wants to have an extravagant funeral for his father and asks Sudhir for money. Power over the household is transferred from the mother-in-law to Vahini, Bhaskar's wife and eldest daughter-in-law. But Sudhir and his wife Anjali struggle to make ends meet in Bombay, an expensive city where one has to work all the time to repay loans and mortgages and just survive in a rented apartment. The rest of the family assumes he leads a comfortable life and cannot imagine urban debt. The family berates Anjali for her Konkanastha Brahmin origins, her fair skin and education. Her son Abhay is supposed to be a good student and a sportsman. Abhay is contrasted to Parag, Bhaskar's son, who is a drunk, wastrel and drug addict. The patriarch's daughter Prabha wanted to study further and leave the house, but her father never let her. Different generations of characters symbolize historical change. The patriarch's mother has lost her memory and still thinks her son is alive. The patriarch's widow Ai has her share of the house sold by Bhaskar to raise money to repay their debts. The Deshpande is only left with their ancestral jewelry, which is a symbol of the family's familial reputation. Bhaskar's daughter Ranju is exposed and drawn to the urban world through the radio and her English tutor with whom she has an affair and elopes, taking the jewelry with her. But the tutor deceives her and steals the jewelry, and Sudhir ends up bringing Ranju back in a taxi to preserve the family's reputation. This ruins Prabha's only hope of seeking her share of the jewelry and escaping the house. Parag is let down by his uncle Sudhir. He hopes to go to Mumbai with him so that he may have access to a more exciting and freer urban life. The play ends with the backyard and orchard being mowed down as it is being sold to save the family from bankruptcy. Chandu is the only son who sacrifices his happiness to take care of his mother and sister. In Desire in the Rocks, the play is a story of incest and the sterility of life. The play has two major characters, Hemakant and Lalita, who are brother and sister, and five unnamed women from the village. The play, like Garbo, depicts the self as a site for a drama between the oppressive norms of society and the transgressive impulses of art and eroticism that challenges these norms. This battle is embodied in the body of the woman, in this case Lalita, which results in the disillusionment of the man and the de-idealization of the woman. Lalita has spent all her life trapped in a wooden mansion. She was her father's adoptive daughter who abandoned her in the mansion. She belongs to a lineage that is believed to have been cursed with no natural surviving heirs. Every child is stillborn, which is why Dada Sahib, Lalita's adoptive father, abandons her in the mansion to pursue his own education. She is reunited with her much older brother 20 years later after he left the mansion to pursue his career as an artist. Hemakant is initially an emotionally detached artist who is willing to isolate himself for the sake of art. Lalita is the embodiment of his unconscious desire, his creativity. He uses her to assume different postural expressions of his ideal embodiment of love and desire. She loves Hemakant but is unable to return her love. She accuses him of being a fake artist, but he believes she does not understand art. There's an authoritarian nature to Hemakant's unconscious world of art and eroticism, and Lalita is willing to surrender herself to own and possess Hemakant, and the transformation in Hemakant occurs when his statues of Lalita are destroyed by the villagers. Lalita, who claims to be a creator like Hemakant, gives birth to a dead baby, which confirms her fear that she has sinned by loving her own brother, for which she continues to live in sin by turning to prostitution to survive. She has no access to her own ancestral property, which is managed by trustees. When Lalita sings to a baby, the child of one of the women in the village, they scold her and outcast her for being an unlucky and sinful presence. Both Lalita and Hemakant realize that they are both sterile creators. Hemakant is stoned and beaten up by the villagers, while Lalita turns to prostitution. They realize the falsity of the body, and even as they surrender to each other in love and intimacy, they are both destroyed in the mansion where they lived. In Sonata, the play depicts the subtle power dynamics between three women, all in their 40s and friends from school. Two of them, Aruna and Dolan, have been living together for 17 years in Dolan's lavish flat in a skyscraper in Bombay. The play's double, Dolan and Aruna, use Subhadra's affairs and lifestyle and the lonely typist neighbor to boost their own sense of superiority and privilege. Intimacy and animosity are the two mutually reinforcing forces that characterize their relationships. They do not approve of Subhadra's promiscuity and her relationship with a violent drunkard. For Subhadra, her friends are a temporary source of relief from her violent and intimate relationship with the man. She's a journalist who has just lost her job. After Subhadra exits, the secret desires and animosity between Dolan and Aruna is revealed. Aruna is a disciplined Sanskrit professor who also writes sentimental stories for a women's magazine. She is also emotionally distant and not open to touching and being touched by others. Dolan is a banker who is self-indulgent and restlessly searches for attention and intimacy. If Subhadra's insecurities are concealed by her obsession with attractive men, Dolan is obsessed with her own Bengali culture, Rabindra Sangeet and food, and Aruna has intellectual pretensions in terms of her career as a prestigious and well-traveled scholar and writer. Dolan resents the fact that Aruna wrote a story of a woman who leads a reckless life and is a thinly veiled allusion to Dolan. She thinks Aruna has betrayed her. Later, Dolan reveals her implicit desire for Aruna and her betrayal when she had an intimate encounter with her ex-husband Avinash. Aruna is willing to let go of the past and restores her friendship with Dolan. In Mahesh Dattani, the first important playwright to write all his plays in English, he came from a Gujarati Sindhi family who was born and raised in Bangalore, and he initially worked as an accountant and then dedicated his life to theatre and writing plays. He was inspired by the work of Alik Padamsee. He began writing his plays in the 1980s, all of which were concerned with exposing the hypocrisy of social institutions of family, religion, gender, and sexuality. In Final Solutions, the play has to do with the problem of communalism. Ramnik and his daughter Smita are liberal Hindus who give shelter to Javed and Bobby, who are apparently being chased by a bloodthirsty Hindu mob. A parallel intersecting narrative is the play of Hardika, Ramnik's mother, who, from the memories of her youth as Daksha, grows to resent the Muslims for killing her father during partition. She has still not lost her prejudice. She has a friend named Zareen, through him, she secretly and through her, she secretly gets to listen to her favorite female playback singers. She wanted to be a singer herself, but her orthodox family forbid her. Ramnik and Smita find the limits of the liberalism tested by Aruna's orthodoxy and Javed's violent intolerance of Hindus. They have to negotiate with two similar ends of the spectrum of religious tolerance. Unlike Bobby, who refuses to identify with his community and is ashamed to be a part of it, Javed is initially a rebellious and violent Muslim who wants to avenge the persecution of his community by Hindus. He confesses later that he was not paid by Hindu right-wing parties but volunteered to place cow carcasses in the house of a Hindu man to trigger the riots. He is later ashamed of what he did. He identifies with Ramnik's wife Aruna, who is an orthodox Hindu woman who observes rituals of purity and pollution. She does not want to share her food or space with people of other castes or religions. Javed identifies with Aruna as they mirror each other's intolerance. He says he is no different from the bloodthirsty Hindu mob that is allegedly pursuing him. By the end of the play, the characters undergo a transformation. Javed forces Ramnik to realize only being a Hindu can afford to give that he, being Hindu, can afford to give him protection. Only he can afford to be liberal. Javed realizes he has lived a meaningless life of violence. Javed compels Ramnik to realize his liberalism is also being tested. When Bobby holds the idol of Krishna in his hand, Aruna's orthodoxy is also being tested, and she realizes that there are probably many different ways to God. And Hardika or Daksha learns from Ramnik that her in-laws were responsible for burning Zarin's father's shop during partition. In Bravely Fought the Queen, the play exposes the hypocrisy of family and the normative role of the family in regulating gender and sexuality. The family comprises Ba, her sons Jitin and Nitin, their wives who are also sisters, Dolly and Alka, and Sridhar, who works at Nitin and Jitin's advertising firm, and his wife Lalita. Dolly's daughter Daksha and Dolly's brother Praful do not appear on stage. Dolly and Alka seem to be trapped in miserable and violent marriages. Lalita has been asked by her husband to organize a masked ball to feature a model for a new line of female nightwear and innerwear called Revati. There's a mix-up in the dates as Dolly and Alka are supposed to visit the Kapoors with their husband on that very day. But the visit is cancelled and Lalita ends up spending time with Dolly and Alka. Lalita is witness to the hidden animosities and desires that threaten to fragment the Trivedi family. A common motif in the play is the bonsai plant that Lalita likes to make, a symbol of the trapped and stunted and sterile lives of the women in the play. Dolly is also wearing a face mask in the beginning of the play to suggest the artifice of her life. The brothers Nitin and Jitin and their mother and wives live in twin houses in Koramangala, Bangalore. They are wealthy, but we discover later on that their advertising firm is on the verge of bankruptcy. They take Dolly's brother Praful's help, who offer them 10 lakhs as an interest-free loan. They resent Praful and look down on him because he apparently tricked Nitin into marrying Alka. Alka seems to have an alcoholic past, which is why her mother-in-law, Ba, does not approve of Nitin's marriage to her. Ba, who is losing her memory and is confined to her bed, constantly calls for Dolly and Praful. From her memories, we learn that she also had a violent marriage, and she had to ask her father for money to raise her sons. Jitin is violent like his father, while Nitin is gentle like his mother. As Lalita, Dolly and Alka share drinks, they lose their inhibitions and all the secrets are revealed. Dolly, for instance, is having an illicit affair with Kanhaiya, their cook, who later ends up being a pure fantasy for her desire for love. Alka is unhappy in her marriage and Dolly resents her for always being the more popular of the two sisters. But appearances are different from reality. We discover Jitin is a violent and unscrupulous man who exploits Sridhar. We also realize that he had ordered Sridhar once to find him a sex escort who will fulfill his pleasures. He also wants to sell their ancestral home to redeem their debts. He wants Nitin to order Alka to leave the house because of her alcoholism and her alleged affair with another man to win Ba's approval. Nitin discovers from Ba that the house has been willed to Daksha and Praful is her trustee, as Ba thinks he was the only one who loved Daksha. We'll discover that Jitin had hit Dolly when she was pregnant and she had an accident which resulted in Daksha's disability. Daksha studies in a special school in Ooty, and it is the sheer guilt that compels Jitin and the rest of the family to take care of Daksha. We also learn Praful is Nitin's lover and that he had gotten Alka married to him to continue their affair. Even the auto rickshaw driver whose auto was driven over by Jitin's car is Nitin's illicit lover. Dolly decides to leave her husband by the end of the play. In Dance Like a Man, the play questions the equation between gender and performance. Ratna and Jairaj Parekh are dancers in their 60s. They have a daughter, Lata, who is also an upcoming dancer who wants their permission to get married to Vishwas, the son of a sweet store owner, provided he allows her to continue dancing after their marriage. Through a series of flashbacks, we discover that Jairaj's father, Amritlal, disapproved of his passion for dancing and berates him for growing his hair long. He thinks dancing is meant for women. Although Amritlal was a freedom fighter who fought against dowry and child marriage, he regrets consenting to Jairaj's marriage to a woman from a Devdasi community. Ratna and Jairaj's guru would visit Amritlal's home to teach them dancing. When Amritlal tries to stop them from dancing, they go to Ratna's uncle's home but return when the uncle makes sexual advances to Ratna. Ratna insists on learning dance from an old Devdasi woman, much against her father-in-law, who bribes the Devdasi to not teach Ratna. Amritlal tries to use Ratna to prevent Jairaj from dancing, but later is forced to relent. He allows Ratna to dance. Jairaj feels insecure because of Ratna's greater success as a dancer. He feels eclipsed by her and is reluctant to dance with her. He has to face stiff competition as a male dancer. He becomes a regular drinker to lighten his sense of insecurity. Ratna blames him for not accepting invitations to dance and for not working hard enough on his own dance. We discover later that they had a son named Shankar who died in his sleep as on one of Ratna's performance nights because the nanny had fed him with an overdose of opium. Jairaj tries to make Ratna feel guilty for being a negligent mother. Ratna wants Lata to become a famous dancer and gets selected in the Foreign Dance Festival in Canada, for which she is willing to compromise her own principles. She is unable to find a mridangam player to replace theirs who had an accident for Lata's performance. She has no choice but to ask Shishazri, a lecherous man who is having an affair with Chandrakala, another dancer who is on the selection committee. Ratna has to flatter and win the favor of the various patrons of the performance competition. Later, Jairaj and Vishwas have an argument on Lata's performance and got rave reviews in the papers. Vishwa is uncomfortable with some of her overtly erotic performances that Jairaj had once performed himself before the army. By the end of the play, there's a vision of Jairaj and Ratna rising to heaven, having learned from their own past mistakes, and Lata becoming a rising star who now has a child of her own. In Badal Sarkar, finally, born in 1925 in a Christian family in Calcutta, studied in a Bengali medium school and Scottish Church Collegiate School. He read Bengali playwrights in his youth and he studied to become an engineer. He later got a diploma in town planning in London, where he watched many important European and American plays. His work took him to Nigeria, where he wrote some of his best plays. Known for his play Ebong Indrajit, Sarkar initially wrote comedies and plays that had to do with the alienation of the middle class individual. His earlier plays were staged on the proscenium stage. He later abandoned the proscenium theatre because he felt restricted by the stage, makeup, lighting, backdrop, etc. He formed something called Third Theatre, which was free of what was necessary for proscenium theatre, all the conventions, engaged in free and direct communication with the audience in an intimate setting, and was free to watch. The audience could, if they wished, donate money. His theatre moved from the proscenium to the Angan Manch, the theatre all round where the audience sat around the room or courtyard and the actor interacted with the audience, to the Mukta Manch or open area and to the street. He believed the function of the theatre was to bring about social and political transformation. In Procession, the play uses the idea of Calcutta as a city of processions to describe the apparent success of many political and religious processions in the city that are supposed to unite people. The play was the first play by Sarkar to be performed in an open area. There are 6 anonymous characters who assume different voices in the play. It describes the suffering and exploitation of the anonymous rural peasantry and farmers. Koka, the missing boy in the play, becomes an allegory of the deprived and the marginalized. The old man is an older version of Koka who's in search of him. Nothing much has changed over the generations as people are in search of their own sense of self. There are many issues covered in the play, from caste violence, poverty, the nuclear bomb, and starvation. The play ends on a note of hope at the possibility of finally finding a procession that would truly unite people irrespective of their differences. In Bhoma, like Koka, is an allegory of the nameless, exploited and suffering rural peasantry. There are 6 anonymous actors who assume different voices. A common refrain is the blood of the peasantry and farmers who have soaked the soil they cultivate with their own blood. There's an ironic contrast between voices that praise the glorious history of the nation and its unity and technological advancements and the plight of the peasantry. The state has money to spend on roads and bridges, trains, but there's no water for cultivation. The farmer is caught in a vicious cycle of poverty and debt. Bank loans cannot be had without any assets or securities. Without money, there can be no capital, no diesel pumps to pump water. The play covers the problems of seasonal employment for some farmers who don't have enough water to cultivate in the dry season and work as hired laborers for big farmers. The stark differences between the urban youth who aspire to get admitted to prestigious educational institutions and go abroad at the cost of others' tax money. The lasting casualties of nuclear power and the atom bomb and the impact radioactivity has on generations of deformed children and on the environment, even if it's being used for peaceful purposes, is another issue handled in the play. The ecological and human habitat, Sundarban, is threatened by the demands of urban expansionism and cultivation and wildlife like crocodiles and tigers that have been preying on indigenous communities. Even the official language of conservation does not ensure the sustainable survival and livelihood of the communities and wildlife. The play ends on a note of hope that that if there was an equal access and distribution of resources, there would be greater harmony and not inequality. One has to clear the poisonous trees of individualism and private property and greed for that to happen. In the last play we discussed, Stale News, the play describes the colonial suppression of the Santhali revolt against the colonial state and their victimhood at the hands of police violence. The nationalist Hindu elite, who both legitimized and opposed British rule, were estranged from the tribals and denied them their autonomy. Their intimate relationship with nature was upset by the incursions of colonial modernity. There's also romanticization of Santhali society as the first agriculturalist settlers. A repeated phrase in the play is Damin Eco, that part of Bhagalpur in Bihar, where the Santalis first settled, when their life of insularity was interrupted by British colonialism. They were exploited by moneylenders who had a very powerful connection with the landholding caste. There's a dead man in the play who symbolizes the invisibilized Santali in the face of state and police persecution and zamindari exploitation. There's also the spread of state and socially sponsored Hinduism that threatens to wipe out the local beliefs and customs of the Santalis. The play recounts the story of Santalis being reduced to slaves and bonded laborers. The ruthless tyranny of the British and the landlords is exposed. The play closes with the Santali revolt, their determination to oppose the forces that reduced them to their plight through their own strategic warfare. Although they were defeated and killed, they refused to surrender. So this ends our overview of this course, and thank you all for listening. Thank you.